And with that, we're live. Okay. We had a little humor if you're watching this after it's been live. You probably aren't going to be aware of all this, but my computer shut down. I was maybe 8 minutes into the original one, into my original display here, and it just shut out. It just shut off. What that usually tells me, though, is the demons don't want you to say what you're going to say. So took a few extra precautions. I think we're good. So let me go ahead and get you caught up. If you haven't seen the previous videos to this, that's okay. You can watch this one. This is kind of a step outward, and we're going to explain everything you need to at least begin the conversation. But I do recommend going back and watching the previous videos from the beginning, since we are doing a study on Revelation. It'll help with the flow and to sort of put things in their proper perspective. But you don't need to stop this one and jump back. You can pick this one up. This actually is going to be sort of its own little thing, because we're going to talk about the history of something. We had, in our last episode, I had actually thought we wouldn't get to the church at Pergamon. We're in the seven letters, or the letters to the seven churches. I guess you could call it 7 letters. There's seven separate letters, but it's all kind of self-contained. So 7, letters to 7 churches. And we got to Pergamon. I didn't think we would, but we did. And it's the church that had compromised, right? But and what had happened is the Christians had started to allow people who were doing both the pagan things and the Christian things. They were mingling them together. They were compromising on allowing people to do basically the wrong thing. Well, what's really interesting is there's this little, it's not even a side note. It basically, Jesus is saying where their church was where Satan had set his throne. And it's sort of the leadway into why they had compromised. That Satan's throne was there. And it's really, really interesting because it's even though it's not expressly stated, you can tell that it's almost like he's saying, because of this is what's happening with y'all. And I think the light is just too bright for there's too much discord, so I'm getting some things here. Man, you can tell the more things go wrong, the more important what you're going to say is. Just how it works. So the question becomes, why does Jesus tell the Christians in Pergamus that Satan had set his throne there? It's an odd statement to begin with, and it's worth exploring. Well, we don't actually have to ask why. It's known. It's a well-known thing. It's called the Pergamon Altar. Now, the Pergamon Altar was an altar to the Greek deity Zeus. It was a Holocaust altar, meaning it was a burnt offering. You would put the animal that you were sacrificing, light it on fire, whole 9 yards. I mean, it was dead. You'd already killed it. There's a ritual to it, but you put on the altar. Now, a lot of people think that the Pergamon altar was a temple, and it's not. It was part of a larger temple complex, yes. But the Pergamon altar was just the altar. And like I said, it was to Zeus. Now, it would be kind of easy to kind of say, well, what does that have to do with anything? Why is Satan's throne there? Why is Jesus calling that one spot out? And there's a lot that connects it here. And the thing is, when you understand what the Pergamon altar is, you'll understand what's happening a lot today and what has happened over even the last 70, 80 years, really 100 years. So, but let's preface all that with where we sort of started with these letters, right? Jesus is dictating 7 letters to the 7 churches of Asia, but more specifically to the angels over those 7 churches. A lot of pastors and theologians have said, well, he can't really be writing letters to the angels. Angels are perfect. Angels don't mess up. The whole 9 yards, right? And so it's really got to be to the pastors. That's not what the text says. It says it actually says to the angels. Now, why is that important? Because some people say, well, angel just means messenger, and it's like, no, I get that argument. The problem is he calls them stars. All throughout the rest of the book of Revelation, stars and angels go hand in hand. All throughout the Old Testament, stars, angels go hand in hand. He means angels. He's not using some sort of code word for the pastors. What we've often lost in the modern church is the idea that there are spirits, we can call them angels, over nations, sort of ideologies, locations, that They live there. They inhabit it. It's where they have rule and regulation. We see a lot of this is more fully expressed in the book of Enoch, where you see God giving angels particular tasks or assignments. For instance, and I think we can kind of read between the lines with when God calls Satan the covering cherub. Some people think that he's referring to the covering of the altar. I would actually argue that Satan is the angel who's over the atmosphere. Like we know that's where he is. He's the prince and power of the air. I think that's exactly what he was. He was over the atmosphere of the earth. That's why they call him the covering cherub. That's what he was doing. His authority is over the air. Humans' authority was over the earth and the animals. In the same way, though, there are smaller, we see in Deuteronomy, and again, this is for the full explanation, hop back to the prior episode. But in Deuteronomy, we see that at the Tower of Babel, mankind was broken up, and each, we could argue, the language group, which would become nations, and which would become tribes and the nations, but each one had a spirit put over them, an angel basically put over them. Some have indicated that they are not actually, that not all the angels that he set over them were good. Some were good, some were bad. We don't really know. As we see we have to assume that maybe all of them were demons, or not really demons. They were evil spirits or evil angels. And the reason we would say that is in Daniel, we see that the king or prince of Persia, right, the prince of Persia, who was the spirit over Persia, was actually resisting Gabriel from coming to talk to Daniel. That doesn't seem like something a good angel would be doing. So we have so there's some interplay there. In the same way, there are angels that are over these individual churches. They sort of oversee them. And this is one of those topics which, again, I think will be really full, in many ways will be more fully explored actually this coming Saturday. Saturday the 16th, Central Standard Time is 1 p.m. We're going to be talking to the Moms of Miracles. We're going to talk about the influence of the supernatural over our lives. Demon possession, demonic oppression, deliverance, all of it. It's going to be great. It's just sort of a macro, it's a micro thing where this is the macro concept. But as far as influence, these spirits do seem to have influence over people, right? And they have a say so. Now they can't necessarily destroy or interact with our free will, but they do influence us in ways. So that's who the letters are to. And that's an important thing I kind of want us to put to the side for right now, but understand how important that is. So let's go back to why Jesus says that the Pergamon Altar is the throne of Satan. For that, we need to jump back a little bit. And I've got some images here, by the way. If you have any questions and you're watching live, or you have any comments, you can type it in the little doobly-doo below, and I can see it, and we can talk back and forth. Wonderful thing. So let me pull up some images here. So this is the Pergamon Altar. Okay? Or let me rephrase it. It's a recreation that's in the Pergamon Museum in Berlin. This is sort of what we think the altar itself looks like. Now, the reason the altar was sort of important, and we'll talk about why people consider it important later. If you notice at the very bottom, right along the stairs, there are these, they're called friezes, okay? They're murals that are carved into the stone. So imagine a statue that's attached to the wall, right? That's a frieze. And the frieze is what's typically called a gigantomachy, which is the battle of the gods and the giants over control of the universe. This also includes monsters like the 100-armed one, and these giants are not necessarily the same giants that we think of when we think of the Bible. They weren't just tall people; they were monsters. They were connected to the Titans and to that sort of primordial thing. Hercules is said to have killed many of these giants. So, what is this altar? So the altar of Pergamus was created. We don't really know when it was actually built, right? This is one of those interesting points of debate. We know about the time it was built. We know it was sort of the reign of this particular king, but we don't know if it was started like 184 BC or if it was started in 159 BC. So there's like a 30-year leeway there, right? Not necessarily as precise as we'd like to be, but it is it's sort of in that field, right? Well, during this time, now it was now the Pergamus, not the city, but really all of Turkey was part of its own little empire at this time called the Attal. Well, okay, there's kind of a bunch of names for it, but usually it's the Attalids. It used to be part of the Seleucid Empire. And during this time, the Seleucid king Antiochus Epiphanes was reigning the Seleucids, and he was dealing with the Jews. And so there's a lot of connections between the two, even though they were two different empires. So that's sort of the time frame. But here's where things get interesting. So Antiochus Epiphanes is a Greek. Well, again, he was Greek, right? He was a Hellenized king, but he was part of the Seleucid Empire, so more Persian, right? But he was Greek. I know we tend to think of Iran as a Muslim, and almost many people kind of confuse it with Arabs, with the Arabic nations, and it's not. In fact, during this time, they were very, very Hellenized. It was another Greek nation. We see a lot of that artwork. It was more Near Eastern rather than Arabian, and it certainly was its own thing, but it was very Hellenized at this time. So during the reign of Antiochus Epiphanes, which actually means like Antiochus, so his real name was Mithridates. When he became king, he changes it to Antiochus the Fourth Epiphanes, and Epiphanes means God manifest. That's what it is. It was God manifest. Now, some of his erratic behavior has a lot of people using sort of a coin of words where it rhymes. I think it's Epimanes. They nicknamed him Epitomes, which means just basically crazy. So it was a play on name, sort of a pun, because he had some erratic behaviors. But so he calls himself God manifest. He has some problems with the Jewish uprising, whether we find the book of Maccabees. And during this time, he ends up taking and erecting a statue to Zeus in the temple and sacrificing pigs on it. A lot of people believe that was what Daniel was referring to about the abomination of desolation. I think it's one of the things he's referring to. Again, prophecy is short term, then there's long term, the ultimate fulfillment. But that's what happened, right? And of course, you have during this period, it's the rise of the Hasmonean Empire. It's independent for like 80 years or so before the Romans show up, and then they finally take over everything. But Antiochus Epiphanes sets up this statue of Zeus and sacrifices the pig. So he completely desecrates the temple. Now, there are some who have claimed that the actual altar that was used for the sacrifice of the pigs was taken and moved to the Pergamon Altar. I don't know that I necessarily can find anything that makes me say, yeah, that's what happened. But the connection there, even if that did happen, is even tighter, because these are two different empires, right? Or at least kingdoms. So I doubt that kind of connection would have existed, where they're like, hey, I just got through, desecrating the Jewish temple. Have my altar, please. That's just not how they worked. But it was a statue of Zeus that was erected. The Pergamon altar is to Zeus. Now, we all think of Zeus. We're all very familiar with him. We live in the West. He's, the storm. He's the storm god. He uses a thunderbolt, whole 9 yards. Well, he has a predecessor. Even though he's Greek, what we forget is all of these stories sort of come from the Middle East because of the flood, right? Tower of Babel, everyone's sort of leaving with the same things. And we see a lot of these interplay very early on with many of these gods, and they're depicted very, very similar because they are just the same god, just in different names, right? Zeus is a storm god, and he's the king of the gods. He's not the God who creates all the gods. Well, he creates most of the Olympian gods, not all of them. And he's not the creator God, but he is the God who rules. In the same way, the infamous villain of the Jews was the storm god Baal. Baal is on the left. As you can see, he is depicted very much the same way as Zeus is. They're both storm gods. Now you're wondering, well, what are they supposed to be holding? Sort of like your modern action figures, where you can put weapons and things in the hands. They both use thunderbolts to strike down their opponents, and they actually had like gold and silver. They look like lightning bolts. They would slide into the statues, and of course those get lost to time because they're made of gold. But the one left is Baal. The one on the right is Zeus, but they're fundamentally the same deity, right? There's no difference between the two. Both are the kings of their respective pantheons. Neither are the creator gods, but they are both storm gods. Basically, Baal is just the earlier version of Zeus. The Greeks pick him up, and they just move on with things, right? Baal is also known as Bel. You'll see that name with the Persians. You'll even see it with the Greeks, or the Celts, rather, later on. So it's not just, they kind of look alike. They are the same being. And as we all know, that Baal is particularly the storm god, was the chief deity of the opponents to the Jews all throughout the Old Testament. We keep seeing him pop up. He's this god who sort of infiltrates, right, and corrupts the Jewish people. So that connection is there. It is very much that Baal is oftentimes seen as a representative, or not just a representative of Satan, but personification of Satan. Same thing. Now, I could point out some of these other connections with symbology, but I don't need to. Zeus, Baal, same thing, right? So essentially, when Antiochus Epiphanes sets up that statue of Zeus in the temple, sacrifices the pig, that's what he's doing. He's just calling out Baal. So we go over to Pergamus. This is almost 200 years later, right? And Jesus is talking to the church of Pergamus and saying that altar is the throne of Satan. Same thing. They don't see the cultural. They're saying that's the same deity and the same thing being worshipped. Now, as all things will, it falls out of disuse, right? Over the centuries, it gets lost to time. It's in Turkey. Turkey becomes the capital, of the Ottoman Empire. Actually, it was the capital of Rome, because Rome, as an empire, moves from the city of Rome to Constantinople, which is in Turkey. Now, a lot of people think that that's when it stops being the Roman Empire, and that's the division. I think that's sort of a myth. They call themselves the Roman Empire. They were the Roman Empire. They last until the 1450s. That's when that's when Constantinople is completely sacked and taken over by the Ottoman Empire, which is the Islamic Caliphate. The Muslims did not have a lot of care or concern for some broken down pagan temple. So it sits there completely unused. Nobody cares about it. Then, in the late 1800s, a German by the name of, I have to write it down so I can make sure I get it correct, Carl Humann, it's probably like Humann, whatever, again, Carl Humann, he comes along and he basically is an archaeologist, sort of an archaeologist. Things were flaky at the time as far as what really constitutes an archaeologist, so it was sort of a new thing at the time. But he goes and he discovers the altar, and specifically the friezes, right? The carvings. I showed you. I'm going to pull the picture back up. So these carvings down here. I don't know if you can see my cursor down here, right? These friezes of the Gigantomachy and the statues. Those were sort of like the important things, and so he wanted to reclaim them. And the Turkey at the time, the Ottoman Empire. This is still before World War I and the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. right? They agreed to all this. So like, yeah, go ahead, take it. Again, they don't care, right? At all. So they don't care at all about any of that. They're like, it's pagan stuff, who cares? So they take it and it gets moved and basically reassembled and put up in a museum, literally called the Pergamon Museum. Again, not everyone's really great at naming things, but it's called the Pergamon Museum in Berlin. Famous museum. It was finished in 1901. They kind of had to scrap it and redo it again, and it would reopen in 1930. Now, the Pergamon Museum and the Pergamon Altar, which was recreated there, and all this stuff is put up there. I cannot begin to tell you how important the Berliners found it. When it was originally erected, people like the entire city went out there. It literally, Berlin blows up after this. I mean, Berlin had always been a major city for Germany, but after that museum opens up, it's like it opens this door. Everyone starts considering Berlin to be the sort of really important. And it blows up economically. People are flocking to it, and this museum is very much seen as sort of like the heart of Berlin for some reason. It's very weird. But people start hanging out there. They have picnics there. It's really a big thing. And at the same time, again, from the late 1800s, remember, the altar makes it there by late 1800s. Around the same time, we have people like Madame Blavatsky popping up. They are theosophists. The best way to describe them, and that's probably an entire show that needs to happen, but she was a psychic medium, and she talks a lot about the Aryan race. So let's take a step back here. A lot of people look at the Nazis. They look at the whole obsession with the Aryan race, the swastika, the Übermensch. They look at this and they say, "Oh, this was all a Nazi thing." No. The connection and the love of the old Teutonic gods, the idea of this Aryan race, this all comes out of this is a revival of the old pagan ways that Madame Blavatsky and the Theosophists sort of rekindle in the German people. It was all pre-existent. The Nazis didn't create anything new. They simply are actually, you could argue, they're an extension of that belief, or you can argue that they co-opted, however you want to view it, but they're coming out of that, right? That was already set into place. And Blavatsky was really big on talking about this Aryan race there was this perfect race that used to rule the world way back in the day, and of course they got polluted by these other races, but they were the megalith builders. They were these perfect people, and we needed to bring them back, right? They were giants. They were blonde. They were the basis. I mean, you start getting into what they're talking about, and you realize, okay, this seems oddly familiar. We'll talk about that in a second. So Blavatsky's putting all this out at the same time that this temple is being rebuilt in Berlin and becomes the heart of Berlin. Well, Adolf Hitler rises to power. Again, preaching and using all of the imagery that had become popularized by the Theosophists and these sort of neo-pagan groups that were popping up, right? They were these sort of neo-pagan Teutonic adherents, and they were popping up all over Germany. Well, when Adolf Hitler goes to do what are called the Nuremberg rallies, which is sort of there was propaganda to sort of say, this is where Germany's going, this is what we want to do, this is how awesome everything is going to be. And so they're out there doing the rallies. They make like multiple movies out there, not movies like we would think today, but more like propaganda reels. Well, the building that was set up and created to be the platform for these rallies is what I'm showing you right now. This right here is the Nuremberg platform. This is what was built for these rallies. And here's the thing. If you think it looks an awful lot like the Pergamon Altar, remember, that's what the Pergamon Altar looks like. If they look strangely and oddly familiar or similar, it's because the architect himself said he was trying to recreate the Pergamon altar, but just to their needs. The Nuremberg, or the setting for the Nuremberg rallies was designed to look like the Pergamon altar. Why? Because of how important it had become and was to the German people. The Pergamon altar had become very, very important to the Jewish people, or not Jewish, but to the German people. And so they wanted to recreate that, to give it its power. Now, remember when I said that the Pergamon altar set up in Pergamos, this thing right here, was an altar to Zeus. It wasn't a temple. It was specifically an altar. I had called it a Holocaust altar because it's a burnt offering. Right? Let's go back to Nuremberg. Nuremberg is where Hitler gives his speech on what he called the final solution, what we now call the Holocaust. This is not a coincidence. This is not random. This is very deliberate. Now it's time to go back to what I was talking about at the beginning. Angels being over these churches, and how God had given humanity with the Tower of Babel, God saw that people were like, we don't want to be under your rule. He's like, fine, I'll give you over to the things that you think you want to worship. That's why Israel is unique. Michael is over Israel. Israel, God pulls out a remnant. That's what Abraham is. He pulls them out. He creates the Jewish empire, or the Jewish nation, that has Michael sitting over it. He's their prince. He's extracted them from the nations. That's why every time, all throughout the Old Testament, we see 70 elders. Why? Because 70 is the number of angels that the humanity was placed under. Now, there may be more now, but every time 70 shows up, what God is doing is he's saying, hey, I'm coming for you. I'm going to redeem these nations. Think about how many apostles were sent out. Same thing. Anytime you see the number 70 or 72, there's argument over why there seems to be some differences in the numbers, but 70 or 72, anytime you see that, that is a sign that God's going to the nations. When Jesus sends out the apostles, 70, right? He sends out 70, that's where they're going. So the question becomes, why is this altar important? Because it is literally Satan's throne. Jesus wasn't meaning metaphorically, it was his throne. That's where he was being worshipped. It gets moved to Germany, after which we have the rise of the Nazi Empire. Who does what? Tries to destroy the Jews as a Holocaust, as an offering. We know that that Adolf Hitler was tormented. The reason he took sleeping pills is that he was tormented at night by what he called images of the new man. He said he was a giant, he was tall and beautiful and terrible. This all comes from the writings of the French ambassador. The reason Adolf Hitler was addicted to these sleeping pills was because he was given these visions, because he was literally being terrorized by the Antichrist spirit. The spirit of Antichrist is seen all throughout history. We know from the New Testament, talking about how it's always been active, but there are certain kingdoms that it sits on top. This will become important later when we talk about the 7 heads of the dragon, right? We'll go into more detail there, but just understand that the spirit has been active and is active in the nations. And any time the Antichrist spirit is present, there is an assault on the Jewish people. And they use the same symbols. If you've read many of my books, you'll note that I connect and can show how the original Nimrod star and crescent evolves into the swastika. It's also the star and crescent that we see used by the Islamic nations today. But the swastika is just a new version of the star and crescent. There's a direct one-to-one correlation. They just goes down different paths. And that we see certain imagery. The aquila, which is the eagle that the Romans used, was also used by the Nazis. Why? Because the Romans were one of the 7 heads of the dragon. Well, again, we'll go into more detail. Let's just for now understand that the dragon is Satan's empire, and each head was a specific kingdom. The Romans were one of them. So what Hitler did was he was actually collecting symbols from all over these different kingdoms, all over these different manifestations of the Antichrist spirit. One of them was, again, the Star and Crescent, which is the swastika. And it is in the fact that he gives his final solution speech on a replica of the Pergamon altar is just further sort of trying to show and prove where he is and who he is, where he's coming from, right? Who he serves. There is a theory, and really, in truth, it's some people call it a principle. We know from the Old Testament that God has said that he does nothing without first telling his servants, the prophets. In the same way, most witches, Satanists, they will all tell you that in the same way, the evil, right? The witches, Satan operates the same way. He has to tell you who he is. This is oftentimes done through, now he'll probably lie about it a little bit, but you have to, if you know what you're looking at, you can tell what's actually happening. They try and hide it, which is where the word occult means. It means hidden. They'll hide it in things, but if you see, if your eyes are open, you'll see what's happening. The Nuremberg stage, deliberately being copied off of the Pergamon altar, is one of those signs. It is basically Adolf Hitler saying, yeah, this is who we are. We are a continuation of this Antichrist spirit that desecrated the Jewish temple, that is dedicated to Zeus, who is actually Baal, right? Who is actually Satan. That's what's happening. That's what they're doing. It's not random that Germany literally just, this altar shows up, then all of a sudden they go nuts and they kill 6 million Jews and another 7 million or another 5 million Poles and Christians and others. That's just not random. You know, humans are bad. I'm the first, believe me, I don't believe that we need demons to make us evil. We're really good at screwing ourselves up. But when you see death tolls in the millions, we had help with that. Enter the Pergamon altar, Satan, Antichrist spirit. It's all interconnected. Because what Germany did was it brought out a new spirit. It adopted it. They saw Madame Blavatsky in what she was preaching, and they bought it hook, line, and sinker. They adopted all of that, and it manifests as the Nazis. In the same way, while there may be spirits over certain nations, it is very clear that humans there's an interplay. We adopt those things. We can start bringing them into us, making them a part of us. And then you start seeing people do crazy things. Let's look around the world today, and let's keep it just to the United States, right? Let's be honest. Things have gone nuts. People are acting absolutely insane. Regardless of what you think of President Trump, please look at the people who are against him. Do they seem rational at all? When he was elected and he was being inaugurated, and you have people lighting things on fire and literally screaming. That's not normal. That's not how rational people behave. And if you think things have just been kicked up to 11, like everything's been kicked up to 11. I wish I should have pulled the image. But the transvestites who are reading to children, there's dozens of images of them, but there's one of them who shows up with literal horns coming out of his head. And you're thinking, why would you do that? Even if you assume, okay, fine, you're a transvestite, you're trying to put your best face forward and show that you should be accepted to these small children. putting horns on your head really the best messaging? That it seems a little, I don't know, ill-themed, but that's what we see. We see it everywhere. People are just going absolutely nuts. Why? Because the spirits are moving. There is influence over nations. And if you are not actively against those spirits, you go with the flow. You start to compromise, like Pergamus did. The church in Pergamus had become compromising because they were sort of going with that spirit a little bit. They were saying, well, okay, it's not so bad if you're going to go, well, we know, because I can guarantee this is how it was. Just my personal opinion, we'll just step aside here a little bit. You can take with this as you will. I could honestly see, because as I mentioned last week, this is one of the few times in scriptures where I see genuine conflict, right? Where we have Paul who's talking about how eating meat sacrificed to idols is nothing because the idols aren't actually real. It's just meat. But he does say not to, for people who are weaker. It's like, look, just don't eat the meat then, right? It doesn't matter. But it's eating meat sacrificed to idols was always sort of a no-no. And Paul sort of takes the next step and says, well, yeah, but it doesn't matter, right? These aren't real things. And in to the church of Pergamus, Jesus condemns those who are eating meat sacrificed to idols. So I'm thinking, okay, there's definitely some sort of conflict here until you realize sort of that broader context. Paul was just saying, look, if the meat is coming from something that's been sacrificed to an idol, because there was a lot of it, and that's how they would just sell the meat later. He's like, it doesn't matter, just eat it with gratefulness, right? The poor would eat that meat. But the broader context of what's happening in Pergamus is they are engaging in the activities of those slaughters, right? They are going to these parties. They're going to the orgies. We see it talks about sexual immorality. That's sort of mixed up in that. That means that these people are Christians. They're supposed to be worshiping Jesus, but then they're going and having these they're participating in these drunken orgies where the meat is sacrificed. So they're actually engaging. It's not like, well, it's all done and here's some cheap meat that's left over. It was, you're at the party where the animal is being sacrificed and you're eating that meat, right? So you're a participant in the worship. And I would almost argue, not almost, I do argue. I think this is my thought. I think they justified all of that behavior by saying, well, Paul says that it doesn't matter. And we're free, we have liberty, we'll just go and do what it is, right? That was their compromise. And I know, and the reason I believe this is because I've seen people use that argument with me as to why they shouldn't stop doing drugs and sleeping with everything that has 2 legs, sometimes 3 legs. And you're like, well, hold on, that's not Christian behavior. You're falling outside the norm here. This, it's like this is not right. This is immoral behavior. And they're like, well, hold on, we have liberty. And I would argue, because I've had that argument given to me, I would almost guarantee that those same compromises, that's the argument they were making. And that's how and I wouldn't be surprised if the Christians within those churches were also saying, well, we can't condemn them or we'll lose them forever, and therefore then they'd go to Satan. We can't do that. We have to allow them to keep doing this. In the same way that the American church has compromised on many, many things. We say, well, we can't condemn that because then they'll think we're judging them and they'll leave. Let me help you out here. If you're not telling them that they're in sin and they're not going to stop it, then haven't you already lost them? I would not be surprised if, again, the church where I saw myself very much with Ephesus, right? It was a church that focused on the theology. They want to get the head stuff right, but the heart was wrong, right? I see myself in that. But at the same time, I look at Pergamus and I see all of us in that church. I do see a church that is compromised. We're going with the flow as a nation, and as a church within that nation, we're like, well, we're going along with the stream. We see these people who are responding to, I'm sorry, what are devils? Right? This is not a pro-Trump comment right now. I will address, Trump politics in general on a different show. But look at how people react. He goes to defund Planned Parenthood. People freak out. Why? It's child sacrifice. Right? Look at who the enemies are. Look at the people who freak out about him. I'm sorry. There's a certain point where you have to look and say, it's the pedophiles who don't like him. It's the people who want to sacrifice children who don't like him. The people who want to make all forms of heathenism popular, they hate him. There's something going on here. And look at their reactions. Look, 20, 30 years ago, you had plenty of people who were advocating for all the same things who weren't anywhere near as freakish as the people running around right now. They weren't doing the things there, but it's like they've all lost their collective minds. And I won't say who, but there are particular politicians that even my wife will look at and she'll come back, she'll says, just look at their eyes. They're freaking crazy. These are not the eyes of normal, sane people. The eyes of the gateway to the soul. These people are nuts. They've lost their ever-loving minds. Why? Because they're literally not in their right minds. They're under the influence of a larger satanic spirit. So the altar in Pergamon, the one that Jesus says is the throne of Satan, right? It moves to Germany. Germany becomes the home of the Nazi Party. What happens after World War II? Think long and hard. Project Paperclip. Sign all those Nazi scientists, the Russians and the Americans. We take all the ones that we can get. We make many of those Nazi scientists very prominent, very powerful people in this country. The most obvious is NASA, right? Werner von Braun. Disney. Walt Disney himself had Werner von Braun standing next to him. They were talking about how going to space and rockets and all of this, and it was a wonderful thing. Werner von Braun was guilty, absolutely guilty of crimes against humanity. He was an occultist. Now, there is some question as to whether or not he died a Christian. He attended a church. So again, I'm not going to judge that aspect of it. But what I do know is that he, Werner von Braun, and Jack Parsons were pen pals before World War II. Werner von Braun was a Nazi. Now, people say, well, the Nazi scientists, they were just trying to get along. No. There's playing along, and then there's being a participant. I don't know where that line is drawn, but that line was absolutely crossed to get that kind of power. Werner von Braun was a Nazi. He was absolutely guilty of crimes against humanity, and he was an occultist. There are many, many other scientists who were brought over by the U.S. government. We adopted all of their teachings. That's where the whole genetic predeterminism aspect is, the whole movement to do what's called, to create post-humanism, where we're going to use genetic manipulation and augment ourselves with cybernetics. That's where it comes from. Do you realize that the Germans actually learned propaganda from us? They looked at the woman who created Planned Parenthood, Margaret Sanger. They looked at her work and the laws that she and the other eugenicists of the United States made. And they're like, hey, those are really great ideas. Let's take those. Let's just take their stuff and use it. Post World War II, that all of that comes here. We adopt all of that. We adopt their science. We don't hold those people. We hold some accountable, but we certainly don't hold all of them. In fact, we actually, I wish I could remember the lady's name. She wrote a book on this. I'll try and have it for the next episode so I can put it in the description. But there was one scientist that we got who was real big on vaccines. And because he was big in vaccines, we got him. Someone recognized him. And we ended up we took him to South America to protect him from justice. Please hear what I said. We didn't just hide Nazi scientists. We helped them escape justice when it was publicly known who they were. We didn't just give them up. We took them to South America where all the other Nazis are hiding. That's what we did. After World War II, who becomes the big dog? We do. There is a fight for the soul of this country. We can't have a church that compromises. We can't be Pergamus, but I think we are. Pergamus was a church that had suffered. They had gone through suffering, but they adopted and compromised. They allowed the evils of the world into their church. And I'm certain that they justified it with all the ways I previously described. We can't kick them out. Then we'll lose them to Satan. We can't tell them they're doing something wrong. The Holy Spirit will work on them. Sound familiar? The Pergamon Altar was Satan's throne. It is still in Berlin right now. But you know who wants it back? Turkey. Yeah, right now there's several lawsuits going on. Turkey wants the Pergamon Altar back. Why? It's still an Islamic nation. Erdogan's hugely Islamic. But they want the altar. Does that make sense to you? Doesn't make sense to me. Until you realize the Antichrist is supposed to come out of Turkey. That's what the Bible says. If you've read my books, you understand what I'm talking about. And don't worry, it'll be touched on. That's why I started with Revelation. To understand Revelation, you have to understand the rest of the Bible. So we'll get a chance to talk about that more in detail. But they want the altar back. There are spirits over the world. Every nation, every tongue, every city. I don't know how far they go, but they go. And they're there. And they absolutely influence those who allow them to be influenced by them. This Saturday, we're going to talk about how not to be influenced by that. How not to succumb to the pressures that these spirits apply to us. How to recognize it. How to fight against it. How to call on the power of God to be who you're supposed to be. And that's the kind of church we need to be. I'm not talking about any one specific church. I'm talking about the church writ large. If you have the Holy Spirit, you are part of the church. You are the church. You are a king. You are a priest. You need to get out there. You need to be the church to the world. But you can't do it if you're Pergamus. You can't do it if you've compromised. We, right now, looks like we have at least a conflict between the spirit of Satan and the spirit of God. That's active in the nation. There's only so much we can do there. But it's also active in your own life. You choose which spirit to serve. The Holy Spirit or the Antichrist spirit. You got to pick. It's your choice to be Pergamus. I'm saying that for me as much as anything. This is something I've been wrestling with for a while now. We're going to talk about a lot more of this kind of stuff in the coming days as it applies to Revelation, and then even more afterwards. And we're going to do more things like Saturday, like this coming up Saturday. So we talk about a lot of this stuff. This is tip of the iceberg, right? Setting a foundation. But there's more going on than we see. Our fight, as Paul says, is against powers and principalities of the air, the rulers of this age. It isn't against people. It's against the spirits. It's a supernatural war that we're in, and you have to participate. You can't sit it out. It is what's happening. So, on that note, I bid you all adieu. I hope to see you all on Saturday. It's going to be a lot of fun. 1 p.m. Central Standard Time, May 16th. If you can't be there live to ask questions, you can always come back and watch later. It's going to be a great time. The ladies of Moms and Miracles are a lot of fun. It's going to be wonderful. So until then, until our next visit next week, again, we'll jump right back into the letters. We may actually get through with them. Maybe not. We'll see. But we're going to go back into the letters. This was just a nice little, hey, we kind of have to talk about this because there's meat there. I would say to keep that on your mind. More of this is to come. We're going to have to sort of take some things apart and really look at them as the book of Revelation continues. So I'll see you next week. Until then, remember, God loves you. He died for you. His Son died for you. He suffered torment for you. I know it's very easy to believe that you are less than priceless, that you are less than worthy, that you are just not somebody who's of any real value. But I would remind you that if Jesus died for you, then you are of infinite value. And who are you to judge? We always use that line, judge not lest you be judged, which, by the way, is remarkably used out of context, but we'll talk about that later. But the number one person we judge is ourselves. You're in no better position to judge yourself than you are someone else. It doesn't mean you can't determine what's right and wrong, and whether or not your actions are aligned with God or not. You can, and you should. We're supposed to. But if you judge yourself as worthless, then you're just going against what God himself said. God said that you're valuable, which is why he sent his Son to redeem you. He wouldn't have done that if you were worthless. Your works are tainted. You are sinful. But he's redeeming you. He loves you. You are a loved and valuable human being. And you're there for a reason. There is someone you are supposed to be helping right now. I don't know who that is. Let the Holy Spirit tell you who that is. But you are important to someone. Go be that king and prince that he asks you to be, and serve the people he asks you to serve. Until then, see you on Saturday.